The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
The webinar will begin in 1 minute. Welcome to this real-world project management webinar. Today we are joined by Josh Ramirez, all the way from America. So thank you, Josh, for tuning in so early your side of the world. Josh is founder of the Neuro and Behavioural Project Management. This webinar is part one of a two-part series and will explore what it would look like to redesign project management around the brain. This webinar will run for 60 minutes, consisting of a 30 minutes of knowledge share, concluding with a Q&A session at the end. If you have any questions for Josh during the webinar, please do jot these down as we go in the comments box. The webinars will be recorded and they will be added to the resource section of the website. This is usually within around 2 working days. Without further ado, I hand you over to Josh. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone in Europe and the UK. It's actually morning over here, so good morning if you're in the States. So without further ado, I'll just kind of get right into it. Essentially, this webinar is about redesigning our discipline, project management, around the brain. And to kind of dispel with a couple of frames of reference that we typically have when we hear about neuro or behavioral science. Typically, we tend to fit those into categories such as emotional intelligence, leadership, motivation, communication, etc. Things that are associated with feeling. Now, while anything to do with the brain also includes feeling, I think we have tended to kind of neglect the thinking side of the brain as a kind of a information processor, as the computer between your ears. So if we think about the brain in those terms, we can view how our processes, interfaces, skills, and metrics all might need to be tweaked to essentially account for how the brain operates as an information processor. So when we think of it in this way, we need to think of, well, there are processes, there are interfaces, there are ways that we do things in project management that are really assumed on the basis of humans being rational beings. And it's not that we are irrational, so to say, as one would stereotypically think of the word irrational, but so much that we are beings based on survival, which causes us to not think so much purely logically as we think we do. So if we think of it in those terms, we need really a complete redesign of project management and the application of science as a foundation under the methods that we practice, whether it be PMBOK, Agile, APMBOK, etc. So that being said, the first piece that we really need to think of and define is that the definition of a project is a temporary endeavor to deliver a product or service, generally defined. This is an issue from the standpoint of the brain. If you look on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see the brain is all lit up under an urgent task as compared to the right-hand side. So the brain is essentially processing information much differently under time pressure. So because the very definition of a project is a temporary endeavor, which time constrains it, it essentially changes the way the brain operates as an information processor. And there are all kinds of ways that it changes the brain. So this is kind of one of the core concepts of redesigning project management around the brain. Because if you look at the brain as a computer, you really can't put time pressure on a computer. And because if you could, then the computer would start skipping a bunch of algorithms or tasks or processing information it needed to process. So at a very high level, this is one of the core concepts as one of the foundations of behavioral project management. So what's the purpose? From a very high level, projects deliver a vision of something that hasn't been done yet, something that hasn't been completed, something that needs to be done for, excuse me, for one reason or another. And these are just a few examples of projects around the world where an outcome is needed. And so that outcome is very important for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. So project management as a whole and as a discipline is very important. So therefore, the effectiveness, the accuracy of our predictions, the efficiency of our delivery is more than just, well, I'm just going to learn project management and, apply maybe unproven concepts or just try things, right? If we have science, we should be applying that so that we can actually accelerate those important projects. So the need for redesign, if we look at it at a very high level, there's about 15 trillion a year in global projects. The impact is about 5 to 7 trillion a year in failed cost and schedule objectives if you just kind of take human factors and apply that at a very high level. And so we really need to apply science to project management, kind of pull out the anecdote, the guessing, high-level opinions, and we need to bring discipline into project management. So really, if we look at it, there's only one way to increase the accuracy and prediction and effectiveness of delivery, and that's starting with the brain, as looking at it from the perspective of information processing. I kind of think of it as the computer between your ears. I did put a side note on here because what I see is that we have a lot of emphasis on artificial intelligence or data, and we do need all of these things, but data is just an input into the computer between your ears. What you do with the data and how you make the decisions on that data is even of greater importance. So if you're to look at it this way, if you look at it from the perspective of a computer has inputs, it has memory, has processing, and then outputs. So data is just an input, but the decision becomes the processor. And so how we process that information is essentially like how the computer has a motherboard with an information processor in it. So really, it's the decision on the data that is most important. So just here's a few brain facts. There's about 100 billion neurons. Essentially, the information speed is about 250 miles per hour. It uses about 20% of your body's oxygen. And there's about 2,500 terabytes of storage in some form or fashion. So that is a lot of processing power, a ton. Think of it like the supercomputer. The problem is that traditional project management assumes that we are purely logical and rational beings. And if you've ever heard of behavioral economics, for example, what they found in economics is that once they looked at that discipline through the lens of behavioral neuroscience, they found that most of their theories in economics had to be put into question because it assumed that humans were just, they had a problem in front of them and they just went about it in a rational method and solved it for the best possible outcome. The reality is humans are optimized for survival first and foremost. And sometimes logic doesn't come first, it comes second. This is a kind of a core concept of that. So if we look at the brain compared to a computer, both of these have inputs. Both of them have memory, so storage of data, and then both of them have processing. So this is where the key is how do we process the information? From a computer side, we are more, or the computer is more logical, objective, or unbiased. From the brain side, we're more self-preservation motivated. We're influenced by beliefs that may have been founded, ungrounded or unfounded beliefs, for example. Computers are good at calculations, but not as good at abstract, while the brain is good at abstract and not as good at calculations. So after the information is processed, then we have outputs. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie with the HAL 9000 computer, which was an artificial intelligence. It comes from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. But I love this statement that he made, and this is, I say he as in the computer, and this actually came from the sequel. But essentially the computer himself, or itself, because he only knew of himself as his own being, of course assumed he was logical and rational. And here's a quote from him. He says, "I'm completely operational. All my circuits are functioning perfectly." Well, I think oftentimes us humans think that all our circuits are functioning perfectly. The interesting thing about HAL 9000 as compared to human beings is that HAL 9000 was actually self-aware. And when he became aware that that the astronauts were going to unplug him, he started to do irrational things. So even in computers, although this is, sci-fi fantasy, it's a good example that once the survival component was plugged in, the survival became the first priority for HAL 9000, just like humans do. And that removed some of the rationality in the decision making. So in computers, processing is logical and rational, yielding an accurate output. Information comes in, it processes, gives you a logical output, makes the calculations, and voila, you have the logical output on the other side. If you were to think about it from the perspective of the brain, information comes in, and under time pressure, for example, processing may actually be bypassed, in which case you never reach the complete logical output. This is one example of how the brain processes under time pressure. Like I said, we don't have examples where we can run a computer under time pressure. I would love to see someone do that study. But essentially, it gives you incomplete outputs. Processing in the brain is distorted due to mental discomfort, otherwise known as cognitive dissonance in psychology. So under mental discomfort, you may get an output that is errored, in which case you never reach the purely logical output. Processing gets deteriorated due to decision fatigue. So as we go throughout the day and we're making decisions, those decisions tend to pile up in the brain, and over time they build up throughout the day, and you get fatigued by decision making. Why? Because the computer between your ears is kind of using power, right? Just like a computer does. So if we were to compare the brain to the computer, This would be like the random access memory, right? The RAM in your brain. And as you go throughout the day, those decisions can be deteriorated due to decision fatigue. Therefore, you get an incomplete output and never really, perhaps in many cases, reach that purely logical output. Another way to look at it, another piece of that is also processing being avoided due to mental discomfort or cognitive dissonance. Once again, the information comes in due to mental discomfort for whatever reason, you have an incomplete output. And to just kind of give you a brief explanation of cognitive dissonance, it's essentially when the brain is introduced to new information. And when it gets that new information and that new information contradicts a currently held belief or value, then what happens is the brain has to make a decision between the new information and what it currently believes. And when this happens, several things occur in the brain. And it's the decision of, do I accept that new information? Do I reject it? Do I minimize it, or do I discredit it? And so this can keep you from getting to that logical output on the right-hand side that the computer would usually give you. In the brain, also, processing can be decreased due to cognitive load. So similar to our element over here, like decision fatigue, cognitive load has a similar kind of behavior. And that is, as you get cognitive load, so for example, you have a bunch of things on your plate and you have to do all of them in a short time frame. You now have 10 different things on your mind. Because of this, your brain is now fighting to prioritize, it's doing all kinds of stuff, and you get an incomplete output once again, never perhaps reaching that full logical output. Processing is also distorted due to social pressure, and I'm sure many of you have seen this if you're in meetings, for example, let's say a war room planning session, and there are many people around the table. There's perhaps your boss or the client. There's social pressures coming from all over the place. And so because of the social pressure, you may not say something, you may not bring up a risk, you may not bring up that issue that you see going on in the planning session, or regarding project delivery or variances, for example. And with that social pressure, essentially information can be distorted, giving you, once again, an errored output. Another idea, perspective on that is heuristics. So this is where the brain defaults to learn patterns or mental shortcutting. And we do mental shortcutting automatically. And I always use this example. If you know the shape of a door, if you look down a hallway, you can see that there's this rectangular dark area, and it has a little circle on the side of it, which is the doorknob. And because you've went through a door so many times, if you look down a hallway and you see a rectangle with a little circle on the side, your brain automatically may assume it's a door, whether or not it is, because you've seen a door so many times. So this is where our brain defaults to a learned pattern. In many cases, we assume that we know something or we see something for what it is. But in fact, our brain may just be referencing a past memory. This would be a mental shortcutting, and it's for faster decision making. It's how we survived for so many thousands of years. You know, you see the lion, you hear the growl, you run, right? So this could give us, once again, errored outputs because we just default to a specific pattern, never get into that purely logical output. So what does this mean for project management? Essentially, all our project management methods are based on a model of rational human behavior. And because of this, we're kind of missing the human elements, and it's not designed for optimal performance. Because of this assumption of rational model of human behavior, we haven't designed our processes, our interfaces, our metrics around how humans think. So once again, we have this diagram where data comes in. On the computer side, it's purely logical. On the brain side, data comes in, it may not be purely logical. And that decision point, information processor, is essentially what is making all the important decisions and the directions for your project. So if we look at it from the applied science perspective, what we find is that there's already bodies of science out there. Some of the science has been out there for 10 or 20 years. And as project management practitioners, we can start to aggregate that science into one place and say, we can apply the science and actually start changing project management outcomes. So it's more than just good management. It's essentially making temporary endeavors possible and making those possible sooner. And that's where I believe that this is so important, applying that science. So, and this is just an example of so much research that is out there. I mean, there are essentially thousands of articles, some in some disciplines, some in others. Some are actually specific to the project management discipline. Some we can find in behavioral economics, forecasting and uncertainty sciences, prediction sciences, behavioral science, neuroscience. There's so much depth and rich research out there. But as a discipline, we haven't aggregated that yet and said, how do we build a foundation of science under project management? And not science for the sake of science, but science because what the science is showing us is that if we apply these methods, we can actually change project management outcomes. And behavioral economics and behavioral finance has essentially already done many of these things for their disciplines. There's actually even, I think, behavioral supply chain management, behavioral marketing, neuroeconomics. And it's essentially sciences led by Nobel Prize winners such as Daniel Kahneman or Richard Thaler, for example. There's so much out there, and we haven't yet applied it to project management as a discipline. So these are just a few of the scientists that are out there. You can go and look them up. Daniel Kahneman, he's a Nobel Prize laureate and cognitive psychologist. Tali Sharot, and I don't know that I pronounced her name correctly. She's a neuroscientist. If you look her up on TED Talk, for example, you'll find some great stuff on optimism bias. Dan Ariely, he's a behavioral economist. Dan Ariely is a behavioral economist, very popular with books like Predictable Irrationality, for example. And then there's Roger Buehler, just another example. He's a social psychologist, but he studies planning and predictions and projects specifically. Also, Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize winner in behavioral economics. You could also find a little short cameo in the movie called The Big Short, I believe is the name of the title of it. And he's also a Nobel Prize winner who has done a lot of great work in essentially applying behavioral science to the field of economics. He's kind of considered the father of behavioral economics. Oh, wait, and there's me. I got lucky. I got to spend like 4 minutes, met him at the Society for Judgment and Decision Making Conference. I was a little starstruck, I have to admit. And then here's a few of ours. That's me on the far left-hand side. Dr. Sherry DeBate, she's in Belgium. She studies forecasting and prediction. Michael Barbera, he studies time pressure and influence. And Dr. Jody Wilson, who studies motivation and leadership. So these are just a few of our scientists and collaborators, so you get kind of an idea of some of the names out there. So I like to ask this question, even of myself: how many of the project processes that we've implemented were grounded in science? And even if I looked at some of my other organizations that I've worked for, I found that we had no processes that were grounded in science. We had some, practical methods. We had, you know, different books that we would reference, some of them based on anecdote or opinion, but we didn't have anything that was grounded in a proven evidence-based method that essentially showed how to change outcomes. And so I look at it as a very, very important, essentially, decision for all of us as we go forward through project management and applying the science, because really every temporary endeavor is essentially a human endeavor. It's accomplished by humans. It relies on humans. It's created for humans. The problem is that all of us as humans tend to be prone to error and irrational decisions. And a lot of times those errors aren't even known until after the fact. And it's not that they're intentional. It's just that our brain is based, its primary purpose is survival of itself first. And that creates automatic processing that causes us to skip information, not see all the information, make decisions based on erroneous information. And what that does is that affects our projects all around the world. 5 to 7 trillion is my estimate based on the percentage of human factors that impact projects. So if you were to go out there and do some research on behavioral economics, for example, you'll find that they're already getting results. There's a bunch of organizations around the world, sometimes called behavioral science units, behavioral insights units, for example. And what they're doing is applying research in different domains, whether it be economics, finance, supply chain management, and essentially tweaking processes to improve human behavior. And these are just a few examples. One book to go out there and read if you guys are interested is called Super Forecasting. That's by Dr. Tetlock. And he's found great increases in prediction accuracy, for example. Now, this is political forecasting, but what they find in prediction is that prediction is prediction is prediction. It's looking forward. And the way humans look forward is often biased. So obviously we'll have a second part to this series. This was just kind of a high-level introduction of behavioral project management and how the brain really processes information and changes the outputs and really impacts how projects are delivered, predicted and delivered. And we'll have more on that in part 2 as well. But we are doing some work in the field in addition to just creating the Institute for Neuro and Behavioral Project Management. Our first piece is creating the NPPQ certification, essentially where we're designing a science-based planning, forecasting, and risk training with certification called NeuroPlan. So at a very kind of summary level, this is something I'd like to leave you with, is from the data side, which we use a lot of in project management, and the data science side. We put tons of effort into data, but I wonder how much does your organization or projects that you know put into decision science? We spend billions on data. Our percentage of budget, at least in the projects that I've been on, are low on the decision science side, if at all. We keep our data processors updated, such as softwares and computers, but we put little into the decision processors, which is that computer between your ears. We design organizations around data, but we do little to design organizations around decisions. We have QA on data, but little QA on decision science. We write processes for data, yet we do little for writing processes for decisions. And data only shows performance, while decisions actually change performance. So with that, I will hand it back over to Lauren and open for questions. And I really appreciate you guys coming to the presentation today.
Thank you, Josh. That was really fascinating. It's been a real good insight, and I'm really looking forward to part 2 as well. So we do have some questions coming in. So just a reminder to put those into the chat box. And we'll kick off with a question from Samuel. He said, processing is deteriorated due to decision fatigue. How do you avoid that? Break decisions up over a period of time? Sort of your inputs would be appreciated, Josh. Cheers.
Decision fatigue, it's one of those things that happens as the day goes on. So towards early morning, decision fatigue is lower. So what my recommendation is that you put all of your highly cognitive work that requires you to be creative or predictive, for example, such as considering risk, towards the front of the day. Leave your administrative tasks towards the end of the day that requires less decision making. So high decision making should be towards the beginning of the day, and low decision making towards the end of the day.
That's really helpful. I've just noted that down for myself. Thank you. Another question here from Scott Robinson. Do you have views on how to apply your approaches and avoid groupthink?
So groupthink is really an element of social pressure, whether it be in a room full of people, or sometimes it can just be virtual social pressure, right? So groupthink should be reduced by essentially taking the pressure, the social pressure, away from the situation. So if you're in a meeting, for example, you might not want to get questions answered publicly so much as sent privately to like a facilitator, for example. So you might have ask the question and then have everyone write down their answers and give it back to the facilitator in such a way that they're either anonymous or that decision isn't maybe publicly in front of the group known as to who made that call or that decision in the social context.
Thank you. Question here from Ramesh. Can you train your brain to cope better with it being pushed? So I guess, for example, when you're trying to reach milestones and deadlines, like you would push a computer, can you train your brain to better deal with those situations?
I think you can train your brain. You have to realize though, if you're under a time pressured situation, that task or whatever it is that is in your brain is still there. You can't just shut it off, so to say. The idea more is to prioritize. So just like decision fatigue, you want to prioritize decisions under time pressure to be under lower time pressure. For example, when we're doing a major proposal, and let's say I'm just going to use a mega project as an example, but let's say it's a 3-month-long proposal. What happens is equal time pressure tends to be placed on all tasks throughout the proposal, whether it be administrative tasks or just building the work breakdown structure or making the information pretty to submit to the client, etc. What we have to learn to do is prioritize where we put lower time pressure and where we put higher time pressure. And what I've found through the research is that anything to do with predictive work, risk analysis, quantifying resources or durations, for example, that's where heavy decision making comes in. And that's where you should diminish your time pressure. So instead of applying equal time pressure to the entire proposal period, for example, over 3 months, you might apply higher time pressure to administrative tasks. But when it comes to sitting down in the war room to make a plan, instead of, let's just put it this way, over the entire proposal period of creating that project plan, probably maybe 1 to 5% is actually spent on the prediction itself. Like when you ask the question, how long will this task take? What we tend to do, because we apply equal time pressure on the proposal, is that the meeting where that takes place also gets high time pressure. Well, why would you do that when essentially it may create an unrealistic milestone, and then you spend the entire delivery period trying to meet that unrealistic milestone or have unidentified risk? Instead, double or triple your typical planning session so that your time pressure is lower during the prediction period. Then apply that other time pressure on more administrative tasks.
That's great. Thank you, Josh. So we've got a question here from Maria. There's a lot of social pressure in the matrix organisations. How do you successfully manage a project without considering the social aspects in your experience?
I think you have to consider the social aspects. It's more how you manage the social aspects. And part of debiasing, even under social pressures, remember social pressure is coming because other people may want something or want you to do something, right? And many times it's because they don't have all the information. What we find oftentimes is that, and even for social pressure situations, is debiasing requires people having information. So for example, when making a prediction, often people will be optimistic because they don't have the data that shows reality. So what you need to do is you need to be able to share the information to those people that are causing social pressure. So part of the debiasing is giving them information so that they do not essentially apply unrealistic pressures. And that's just kind of one example.
Thank you. So the next question here is from Ashok. He said portfolio management is based on decision making, so we're making advances in this area. The issue is we need to please many stakeholders, and that produces suboptimum outcomes. What would you suggest we could do better with this issue, pleasing many masters?
This is kind of similar. My answer is going to be kind of similar to the last one, because once again, stakeholders are also creating social pressure for the project team. My experience so far has once again been access to the information that they need, often because they're dealing with uncertainty. So a stakeholder may become anxious because they are all dealing with uncertainty for their stakeholder group, for example. So when they understand what the team is dealing with and the issues that they have to work through in the project, once again, information can help to kind of debias their perspectives. So the stakeholder is obviously dealing with stakeholders. It requires information and perspective from many different views. But I find that information tends to debias more than anything. And so letting your stakeholders know versus, we tend to, because it's almost like the ostrich effect or deliberate ignorance, where we kind of cover our eyes, right? In many cases, we tend to withhold information because we're afraid, if someone saw that, they may get anxious, they may demand something. In my experience, try to give them as much information as possible. So you also need to break down barriers of kind of the in-group. So if they are viewed as an external person and they feel like an external entity aside from your project team, they are going to treat you with more what they call attribution error, which is they assume that your character is flawed or your team is flawed because they're not getting the information they need. They see you as a separate entity. You need to humanize that relationship so that people feel like they're part of your group and not an external part outside of your group.
That's really good advice. Thank you, Josh. Got lots of questions coming in, so it's really nice to see that the subject's been well received. Tracy has said, what happens when you have to process complex, detailed information and then make a decision? Should there be a gap between the analysis and decision based on processing it within the brain?
Yes, with an exclamation mark. Because so there's, and I don't know how many of you guys are aware of System 1 and System 2, but System 1 is our fast automatic system. And essentially we make very biased and heuristic-based decisions when in System 1. We actually operate in System 1 95% of the day, give or take. So when data comes in, it needs to process, but you're distracted by many things. You're distracted by the input of the data itself. You need to give some processing time and allow a gap between when the data came in and when you make a decision.
Thank you. So move on to Scott's question. He said he's interested in your views on how we ensure diversity of thoughts or different brain styles in project teams so they can build on each other's strengths and minimize each other's weaknesses.
Guess I didn't understand. Was that a question or?
Yeah, so he's interested on your views on how we can ensure diversity. So say, for example, you've got someone that's very strong in a certain area, perhaps say conflict resolution. You've got someone that is weak in that area. Sort of how can we build teams that have got a good diversity of these skills?
So it's a kind of a diversity of thought question under the pressure of other people, so to say, is kind of how I'm taking the question.
Yeah.
How do you ensure diversity of thought in like a project team?
That's it, yeah.
The first bias that comes to mind when I hear that is attribution error again. So attribution error is essentially our perspective on other people. If we see them as kind of outsiders, we don't know them very well, for example. We may assume that they are flawed in some way, or because they don't meet our stereotypical frame of reference for how a certain person should be, like how an IT person should react, or how a manager should react, or how a planner should react. We have all these stereotypes and heuristics in our brain. And so when someone doesn't fit into a frame of reference, we may start to kind of push them to the outside and may not consider their opinion. So then that diversity of thought is essentially shut off by the fact that we typically, most of all of us humans, have some level of attribution error. So for example, a good example of this is if you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off and like pulls right in front of you, you're gonna be like, you start cussing expletives and why don't they, like improve the licensing or make people take a better driver's test. That person's just, doesn't know how to drive. So that's attribution error. We don't know all the information. We just attribute that error to their character or their personality and assume that they are flawed. Well, from the driver's perspective, you may have been in their blind spot. Something may have distracted them just at the right time so that when they decided to pull over, they didn't see you. And so when we get the perspective of the other person, diversity of thought can actually increase. But you have to kind of drop down that kind of obstacle or barrier of attribution error. So I would highly encourage you to go and look up the attribution error. And there's also the fundamental attribution error. And then I think it's the ultimate attribution error. There's also an attribution error that applies to groups as well.
That's a really interesting way of thinking of it. Thank you, Josh. So we've got a question here from Philip. We may make poor decisions due to budgetary constraints. Seeing as money doesn't actually exist, we came off the gold standard in 1931. How can we either improve our decision-making processes or, better still, introduce a more realistic economic paradigm which involves problems altogether?
So the first part of your question actually broke up.
Okay, I shall start again. We may make poor decisions due to budgetary constraints. So how can we either improve our decision-making processes or, better still, introduce a more realistic economic paradigm which avoids the problem altogether?
So did you say project constraints?
Budgetary, so financial.
Project. I'm still not getting that word. Did you say project?
Budgetary, so financial, money. Is that coming through?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll skip that one. I will email that across to you at the end. So Philip, I'll be able to get back to you personally on that question.
Okay, sorry about that.
It's all right, no problem. Samuel has said it's very interesting, the gap between complex decisions. Does this lead to a second guessing, and is that better, or is this process of second guessing an improvement?
I would say second guessing is an improvement. In many cases, we make decisions once again in system one, which is the automatic decision. And because we make decisions under this kind of automatic system, our brain relies only on past experiences and beliefs, and those aren't always accurate. And so what happens is we just apply this automatic bias, we apply this automatic frame of reference, and then the decision isn't as logical as it could be. Unless you absolutely have to make a decision at that moment, I think second guessing is actually part of your system too, weighing all the options. Now, obviously you don't want to kind of go into analysis paralysis, so to say. You need to eventually make a decision, but at least second guess it once and make sure that you have all the information. And sometimes your brain is actually second guessing because subconsciously in your system one, it's giving you an intuitive response that says, maybe I don't have all the information.
Thank you. This is a really interesting question here from Lucy. She said, building on the earlier question of diversity, do some people have a more logical processing capability than others? For example, those on the autistic spectrum, are their decisions less flawed? They do often tend to be a lot more analytical and logical with their thought processes. So that would be really interesting to see your views, Josh.
Wow, that's a good one. Huh. Okay. So there is some research on personalities. I don't study personalities a lot, but I can tell you that people that tend to be more open-minded tend to process information a little bit less biasedly. And the reason is that they're willing to look at information from all perspectives without the cognitive dissonance shutting down the rest of their processing when they get new information. So remember how I was talking about cognitive dissonance earlier? It's essentially that mental discomfort when we have new information that essentially contradicts our existing belief. So if someone is able to deal with cognitive dissonance better than another person, when new information comes in, they'll actually include that. And so they actually become, for lack of a better word, more intelligent on that issue that they're getting more information about. So compared to the same person that is exposed, or another person that was exposed to the same information, one takes in the information and accepts it. One takes in the information and rejects it. Now, as we look at, information building on top of information, now the person that accepted the new correct information now has an exponential effect to go and branch out and expand on that information. So yes, there's different personalities are essentially going to process information differently. And being able to accept that information is essentially allows them to broaden their intelligence on the issue. I don't know much about autism as an example, but I know that, for example, introverts process information sometimes a little bit differently than extroverts. So extroverts tend to be more social, introverts sometimes less social. And so introverts may also be processing information different than an extrovert.
I really enjoyed that question, especially the answer, Josh. Thank you. I have to say, I've been in meetings before when we get given information, and when we recap on it, it's like we've all heard completely different things, yet we've all been in the same meeting. So that was
Right.
really good to listen to. Thank you. I've got a question here from John. Do any of our innate self-preservation biases and flaws actually support good project management?
Oh boy.
You're getting grilled on these questions. They're fantastic.
So that is a very difficult one. So I'm going to go to automatic processing in system one, for example. And there are two schools of thought on this. And there's actually a great article out by Kahneman and Klein called The Failure to Disagree. And it was essentially Kahneman has studied for several decades the error side, or kind of the negative side, of automatic processing, while Klein has studied the positive side of processing information, or automatic processing. The difference is that Klein was studying automatic processing in a military environment where people were trained with essentially to muscle memory, where you do something over and over and over again. So when you're put into a stressful situation or a survival situation, you make a decision based on your automatic processing. The issue is that under Klein's position, automatic processing was good. Why? Because if you tell someone to do the correct thing 1,000 times and you make them practice it, under a stressful situation or a survival situation, they'll automatically go to that correct decision. So the issue is that if we don't have essentially deliberately practiced good habits, and I mean really deliberately practiced good habits, we will default to whatever our survival system thinks is the best decision. So if you don't have deliberate practice practiced under a slow system 2, making correct decisions, under survival, your brain will just go to the fastest, most available information it has, which often can be wrong.
Thank you, Josh. We're concluding with our last question here. So if you've got any more questions, quickly type these into the chat box. We've been asked, how can we learn to accept cognitive dissonance?
I don't know that you can necessarily accept dissonance itself so much as realize that dissonance is really a filter. Cognitive dissonance isn't bad. What it is it's a way for your brain to filter out things that it thinks are relevant or irrelevant. The problem is that the brain is an association machine. So it's always associating something with a past memory or a past experience. When it has created, or say, for example, it has a belief system because it has been in an environment for so long, anything that contradicts that environment is actually could give you an automatic gut feel that this is bad. An automatic gut feel that this is bad doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. It just means that your brain has seen the opposite of what you just experienced so many times that when you encountered this new thing, it felt wrong. And it's just giving you an indication that, hey, you may be in danger, you may need to run, etc. Only in an office environment or a business environment, those feelings aren't necessarily rational. So cognitive dissonance can be good. What you need to do is learn to use cognitive dissonance to say, is this new information relevant? And then try to process the information slowly, not fast, because fast thinking goes to biases and heuristics automatically. And then process, do I need to accept this new information? Do I need to reject it? But because of the mental discomfort, we often discredit it or minimize it, for example. The thing with cognitive dissonance is that we have to realize that it's going on, and not just as soon as we get a mental discomfort associated with new information, just automatically reject it or automatically discredit it or automatically minimize it. The point is, you got to slow down and realize your brain is automatically processing information. You have to slow down slow enough to actually evaluate instead of automatically reject.
Perfect. Thank you, Josh. So that brings us to the end of our presentation webinar. A huge thank you extended from APM for the Real World webinar series joining us today, Josh. It's been really good insight, and I look forward to our next session on the 19th
My pleasure.
of March. So again, this webinar is recorded. So about 2 working days, it will be live on our resources section. But Josh has left his contact details here. So if you have any further questions, feel free to link in with him on LinkedIn. So I'm going to end the webinar now, but a huge thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Right, have a good afternoon. Well, have a good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Bye, everybody.